We continue to the second speaker is Madeleine Vaskerty from Graz College. The lecture will deal with the Holocaust in the Slovakia, letters to President Jozef Tiso. Please, Madeleine.
Hi. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes.
And see me, okay. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Thank you, Chaim, for organizing this conference. I'm very happy to be serving on this panel. I'm going to go directly into a PowerPoint so that we can cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Here we go. So to start with, my name is Madeleine Vaskerty. I am a Samuel P. Mandel Fellow in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies doctoral program at Graz College in Pennsylvania in the United States. I live in Bratislava, Slovakia, however, where I conduct Holocaust-related research, which is what I'm going to be speaking with you about today. Most relevant for this conversation is that I used to work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And if anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch with me about the things I talk about today, my email is at the bottom of the screen, and I'll share it again when at the end, as I get closer to the end. What I research are letters that were written to then President Jozef Tiso about the so-called Jewish question in the Slovak state. For those of you who might not know, Slovakia was a Nazi client state. I'm going to operate from the assumption that most of the people listening today don't know a whole lot about the Holocaust in Slovakia. So I'll try to incorporate as much information about the history as I can. Obviously, I can't tell you the whole Holocaust history as I discuss what I'm doing. When I worked for the Holocaust Museum, the museum sent me to Slovakia several times to look for archival evidence about the Holocaust and how it unfolded in the country. My guess is that there are 3 million pieces of paper in that archive, but I came across some letters that I simply couldn't take my mind off of. They were dramatic personal letters or petitions to the then president asking for assistance with some aspect of the Jewish question. There may be as many as 20,000 such letters, and they're from Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and they're located in the office of the office of the President of the Republic at the Slovak National Archive. I also researched the fates of Jews who petitioned Tiso, who were asking for mercy from anti-Semitic measures. This correspondence hasn't been studied. Petitions to government have been studied even less. And looking at these letters and studying them systematically reveals the scope and the nature of Jewish suffering as it was happening in real time. It helps add victims' voices to the historical narrative, and it opens the door to studying Jewish petitioning practices within the context of European Holocaust history. The letters that I have found so far, the youngest letter writer was 5 years old. The oldest was 89. Letters came from all over the country. They came from men and women, though the very vast majority of the letters were from men. I would say as much as 95 to 98% of the letters came from men. They came from rich people, poor people, people from all walks of life, and fell basically into 4 categories. Sometimes it was Jews just asking for help. Sometimes Jews wanted exemptions from anti-Jewish measures, and that's what we'll be speaking about mostly today. Non-Jewish public servants who were married to Jews who were supposed to be losing their jobs because of the Jewish code, which we'll also be talking about in a moment, and would-be Aryanizers, people who wanted Jewish property and who wrote to complain that the system was corrupt and unfair. I will tell you very quickly 3 important aspects of Slovak Holocaust history. Slovakia was a Nazi client state. It was created in March 1939 as a byproduct of Germany's aggression against Czechoslovakia. It was not occupied by the Nazis until 1944. And up until that point, all anti-Semitic measures were carried out by the Slovak government on its own initiative using its own resources. From March 25th until October 20th, 1942, the Slovak government deported nearly 58,000 Jews in 57 trains. They paid the Germans 500 Reichsmarks and train fare. After the Nazi invasion, 13,000 more Jews were deported or were shot, killed on site, but that was under Nazi auspices. The part that I'm focused on is when the Slovak state was carrying out its anti-Jewish measures and deportations on its own initiative. A second important aspect of Holocaust history in Slovakia is that the state claimed that anti-Jewish persecution was in complete alignment with Christian teachings and values. Many Catholic clergymen were very visible in Slovak politics in the political arena. Then President Jozef Tiso was a Roman Catholic priest. And there were some protests from the Church and the Vatican, but there would be no way to cover, that's a very nuanced and large topic. There would be no way to cover that today. However, what's important to note is that the state had said that all of these anti-Jewish persecutions were in keeping with Christian teachings. The third thing that distinguished, and it's not the only country where this took place, is that the anti-Semitic legislation allowed for exemptions. There were 18 different kinds of exemptions in Slovakia, but they were not usually granted for humanitarian reasons. It was usually granted when the Jewish applicant had some special skill that was needed for the economy. So my topic is people who wrote letters to Jozef Tiso, and I will tell you just a little bit about him. He was a very charismatic Roman Catholic priest. He was president from 1939 to 1945. In addition to being president, eventually he held the posts of prime minister, chairman of the dominant political party, the supreme commander of the army, and the Alica Guard, which was a paramilitary organization that carried out anti-Jewish measures on the ground. And he had the power to grant exemptions. On April 15, 1947, he was hanged for state treason, betrayal of the anti-fascist partisan insurrection, and collaboration with Nazism. He's a very controversial figure in modern day Slovak discourse. And when I started to conduct my research, I had no idea that I was walking into such a controversial topic. People say that he either deported all of his Jews and the Jewish citizens and murdered them, or that he saved thousands and thousands of Jews. And both of these things cannot be true at the same time. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to give you just a couple of definitions so that when I read to you some excerpts from these letters, you'll know what they're referring to. Aryanization and liquidation. Aryanization was the state-sponsored transfer of Jewish property into non-Jewish hands. The state Aryanized or liquidated businesses and personal property, which rendered the Jews poverty-stricken and isolated them. This sign says Jewish business. Under law, there was a point in time when Jewish businesses needed to be identified as such. Roughly 11 or 12,000 businesses were liquidated, and their assets went to the state, and roughly 2,500, 2,600 businesses were Aryanized and placed into Christian hands. Okay, so Gabriel was a shoemaker. He was 56 years old, and he wrote to Tiso on March 8th, 1941, to ask to be allowed to keep his shoemaking license. He writes, "I am unemployed and desolate from poverty and hunger. And so, as a Jew, I don't want to go down a bad path and become shameful in the eyes of the world. I ask you humbly, Your Excellency, to return my shoemaking tradesman's license, or perhaps even give me permission to be a shoemaker's apprentice. Gabriel had been a master shoemaker, and he had won international awards for the shoes that he made, but he had to figure out how he was going to support himself financially after his business was taken away from him. He was deported to Auschwitz about 16 months later, and he perished there. He did not return. Okay, so another definition I wanted to give you is about the Jewish Code. The Jewish Code was a government decree that consisted of 270 paragraphs. It was issued on September 9th, 1941, and it basically stripped Jews of any basic civil or human rights they still had at that point. The code defined Jewishness on the basis of racial criteria. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothes, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, going to restaurants, parks, and movie theaters. All of that was restricted or forbidden, along with contact with Aryans, quote unquote. Jews could not have driver's licenses, typewriters, radios, telephones, photographic equipment, bicycles, antiques, or hunting and fishing gear. Later, I would see ordinances about stamp collections and things like that. This was Government Ordinance 198/1941 on the legal standing of Jews. And this was the document that generated most of the letters that I've seen in the archives. The reason is that paragraphs 255 and 6 of the code gave Tiso the power to grant exemptions on a temporary or permanent basis, or partial exemptions, or exemptions from the entire code. This brought about a huge amount of requests. And in the course of my research, I've learned a few things. I'm still learning. But basically, the process for handling these requests was handled very bureaucratically. There was an established process. They cost money if you were lucky enough to get one. The amount was on a quote-unquote sliding scale based on recommendations from the district office where the letter writer lived. These communications were not private messages between a citizen and government. The communications became sometimes extremely public, which I believe added to the persecution that Jews were experiencing under the Slovak state. Very few got the mercy they requested. And the topics in the letters basically reflect the various ways that the Jewish code was affecting the letter writer personally, and not all people were affected the same way. This man, Moritz, was from Piestany. He was a retired 71-year-old man who was blind. And Decree 186 confiscated half of the money in his bank account. And he wrote to try to get the money back from another agency. But when exemptions became possible, he wrote to Jozef Tiso on January 23rd, 1942. The loss of 1,520 crowns and 40 cents was the last money I had for my old age. I am weak and ill, in addition to being completely blind. I have exhausted my last means, which were supposed to cover medical expenses. This small bank account is all that me and my 69-year-old wife have to live from. And the loss of half of my small account means that we are now utterly destitute. I can never work again. This man and his wife were deported 3 months later. They most likely perished in Sobibor. And in the meantime, the Office of the President of the Republic wrote to the district office and said, have this man and his wife appear before you, state whether they still need the funds, and what religion they are. And the district office wrote back and said this is no longer an issue because they have been deported and they did not return. They did not return. Let's see if I'm doing okay on time. I am. I have another person who I would like to tell you about today. Her name was Alica H. She was 23 years old. She was also from Piestany, and she wrote to Tiso 2 times. The first time, she wanted to get his permission, get an exemption so that she could marry her fiance. She had converted to Lutheranism in July of 1941. She wanted to marry the person who she called her young man. And because she was identified as a Jew, and because of the Jewish code, she was no longer permitted to marry the man that she was in love with. And she writes, now, because of the Jewish regulations, I needed to end my relationship with my young man. We had become very fond of each other and we wanted to marry, but now we are both suffering terribly. Her letter was written on November 20th, 1941, and she basically wrote and said that her future happiness lied in his hands. She didn't receive a response, so 5 months later she wrote again, and her second letter makes no mention about a fiance. She worked as a clerk in a company that made pudding, and she was responsible for multilingual company correspondence, and she was fluent in 3 or 4 languages. And she was supporting herself and her parents with a relatively small salary. And she wrote on April 17th, 1942, my parents' health is faltering because of daily suffering and anxiety-provoking occurrences. My father is undernourished and cannot perform any physical labor. All day long he yells at us. Because of a previous illness, my mother cannot tolerate stress. At this point, she's just concerned about existential matters and her parents. She wrote that she wanted to honor her parents because they had sacrificed so much for her so that she could go to school. And now it was her turn to take care of them, and she felt powerless because she couldn't. In the end of July 1942, both of her parents were deported to Auschwitz, where they perished. The only information I've been able to find out about her is that she was deported and she survived the war, but all other information in her particular case is unclear. I'm going to guess she married somebody eventually and changed her name, but I can't find any further trace of her after a report she made to a Jewish chaplain in a DP camp. Obviously, there's no way to cover all of this material. I have hundreds more letters, and each one is unique and different, very moving. I couldn't forget the plights of these people, and I plan to continue with my research. I've written a book on this topic, but it's not in English. But here are some recommended readings if you decide that you'd like to know more about this. Also, I've written some articles in English, and I'd be happy to share them with you. And that's it from me for today. Let's see if I can stop sharing. That's it.